Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Sheviis, chapter 8, Halacha 1. If you're following along in the art scroll, we're on 60A1. Well, now we're going to be covering what kind of uses you can do with the plants. That's what chapter 8's about. And the Mishnah is going to cover a few different topics. One is going to be human food, animal food, plaster. That's basically going to be like you're taking it and you're making it into a medicinal compound that you can put onto the outside. And that's going to be for a human or an animal. And then we're going to talk about firewood. So this is where it's going to start off. And then we're going to get into more uses later on as the other Mishnahs come. So the Mishnah starts off and it says, a major rule was stated regarding the products of Sheviis. So this starts off and it says kalal gadol, and anytime it says that, this is like a major standing theological point for how this works. Okay, it doesn't just say it's a rule; it says gadol, right? So this is a major rule, and this is something to take note of. This is really like the point of this. Okay, so this is like put on the red flags all over this and pay attention. So the Mishnah continues and it says, any product of the earth that stands to be used specifically for human consumption may not be made into a medicinal or cosmetic plaster for humans. So now they're including even cosmetics like makeup. Now, we covered this before with the Vilna Goan's commentary in chapter 6, and the issue over there was if you're taking for the dyes and you're taking something that could be used for human consumption and you're squeezing it out to get the juice out, the problem is you're left with the pulp, and the pulp could have been eaten. And now since you've squeezed out the juice, the pulp is no good. You can't go eat it anymore. And the problem is now you're wasting something that's a food product. It becomes very problematic. And so it must be that when you're coming to make a cosmetic for a plaster, it's going to be the same case. And this is also, as we covered in chapter 6, going to be the same case for a medicinal plaster, a compound. So over there, the issue that we covered in chapter 6 was where we're making this human food into a medical plaster. And now we have a case where it has to get used for only a sick person. So if you go and you take this medicinal compound and you put it onto a person's outside of the body, like an arm or something like that, and the person is not sick, it's not going to have any use and it's going to be wasted. And one of the ideas that we covered in chapter 6 in Sheviis is going to be that it has to be available for everybody. So because it would only benefit a sick person, and if you took this compound and you put it on the outside of a person who is healthy, it would do nothing, it's going to be wasting. So let me cover this rule again. It says a major rule was stated regarding the products of Sheviis. Any product of the earth that stands to be used specifically for human consumption may not be made into a medical or even a cosmetic plaster for a person, and surely not into a plaster for an animal. Why? Because it has Sheviis sanctity, and edible produce has to be used for eating or other similar kinds of things. Like you can use the oil for lighting candles, but it has to be something that's a basic inherent use for the item. So the idea is that you can't go make it into a plaster or a medicinal, something for a medicinal purpose or a cosmetic. And the medicinal use of edible Sheviis products is going to be also, by the way, prohibited even for people. So if it's going to be prohibited even for people, well, surely it's going to be prohibited for animals. So the Mishnah continues and it says, any product of the earth that does not stand to be used specifically for human consumption, but is used for animal consumption may be made into a plaster for a person, but not for an animal. So this, by the way, has this idea about upgrading. So you're taking something that was fit for just an animal. A human can't get any benefit for it. And then, yes, it has Sheviis sanctity, but you're upgrading it to benefit a human. That's going to be allowed, but you can't go and take it and turn it into a medical plaster for an animal because you have the same problem of wasting food. One of the things to remember and to have in your mind is that the Torah itself is going to lay out that the Sheviis produce is for people and animals. So this is why the animal thing all comes in, because it's a part of the pasuk. Mishnah continues, and it says, "And with respect to any product of the earth that does not stand to be used specifically for human consumption, nor for animal consumption, if one intended to use it for both human consumption and animal consumption, we apply it to the stringencies of both the animal foods and the human foods." So the idea here is a plant that could be used as an animal food or human food. Also, by the way, we could use it as firewood. That's going to be coming up in the Mishnah. And so you could have these plants that have multiple uses. And the classification is basically going to be, what is it going to be when you have the intent, when you actually pick it from the ground? So did your intention be to pick it and use it for firewood? Okay, then it's going to be for firewood. Did you pick it and intend it to feed to your animals? Okay, then it's going to be animal feed. Did you pick it and intend it to go for your salad? Okay, then it's going to have the status of human food. So this is the way that, you can pick it, and, it could be something that could be used either for humans or animals or something like firewood. And basically the idea is that the idea of what you're going to use it for when you're picking it, this is going to be the designation for it. Now, it's going to come up a little bit later on that this designation can change if you end up changing your mind later on, right? So we saw that in Masechet Peah as well, by the way. So the Mishnah is going to finish up and is going to say, and if one intended to use it for firewood, it is treated as firewood. It has no Sheviis sanctity at all. And it says examples of such products are the pennyroyal plant, the hyssop, and the savory. So these are going to be something that you could use either for animal food, you could use it for people food, you could use it for firewood. And so it's basically going to be what's your intent when you're going to be picking this. So if you're picking this for firewood, it has no Sheviis sanctity. But if you're picking it for human food and you're going to use this oregano, they say that hyssop is like oregano, like wild oregano, and you're going to use it to go and put it with your eggs in the morning, then it's going to have Sheviis sanctity. So the Gemara is going to start, and the Mishnah was starting off saying a major rule was stated regarding the produce of Sheviis. Now, the Gemara wants to question this designation between human foods and animal foods, and it wants to understand in a deeper way what happens when you turn it into a plaster and why you can use it for one but not the other. So Rabbi Bon Barchia asked in the presence of Rabbi Zera, both human foods and animal foods were included in the scriptural passage of Sheviis, meaning that each of them has Sheviis sanctity. So let's actually open it up and read it. So that's going to be in Vayikra, that's Leviticus 25:6 and Pasuk 7 as well. And it says, the Sabbath produce of the land shall be for you to eat, for you, for your slave, and for your maidservant, and for your animal, and for the beast that is in your land, and all its crop shall be to eat. In other words, this is saying that this deals with both animals and humans. Not only that, it creates subsets, right? So there's a subset of people. It's for you. It's for your slave. It's for your maidservant. And then it creates another subset for the animal. It says the animal, that's going to be your animals. These are domestic animals. And then it talks about the wild animals in the land. It's also for them to eat as well. So the question the Gemara is going to pose says like this. It says, what do you see that leads you to say that human foods may not be made into plaster for humans and an animal food may be turned into plaster for humans? In other words, okay, fine. You can go and you have a problem with turning a human food into a medical plaster. We covered that in chapter 6. But what exactly is the mechanism that takes this food that is designated for an animal? The animals have the right to eat it. It's in the Torah. And now, they also have a prohibition against wasting animal food. Now you're taking it and you're making it into a medical plaster for human to use. You're taking it away for an animal, effectively. And it still has Sheviis sanctity. So how does this work? That's really what it's trying to understand. And Rabbi Zera is going to explain it. And Rabbi Zera says to Rabbi Bon Barchia, he says, the verse states, the Shabbos produce of the land shall be for you to eat. And he says that this implies that it can be used for medicinal purposes and for plasters. And the term for you in this verse implies a limitation of this teaching. It's limiting the teaching as follows. It says Rabbi Zera, human foods which are designated for you are for eating and may not be made into a plaster for people. But animal foods, it does not have a designation for you in that pasuk. And because it doesn't have the for you designation in there, it can be made into a plaster for people. So the verse should be understood as follows, according to the Rosh Cirilio. He's saying the Shabbos produce of the land for you, and this is going to be designated for human consumption, it shall be to eat. And there's two layers of implication that come from the statement, says the Rosh Cirilio. The first is the produce designated for you, that's going to be people food, may be used only for eating or some similar benefit, but not for making plaster. Again, we covered this before. You're going to end up with wasting problems. So even in a case where a healthy person uses this medical plaster, will have no use for them. And so it would have been wasted. So there's also an idea that it has to have general use. In other words, that any person could generally use it, not just a sick person. So then we have this other case, says Rosh Cirilio, where produce not designated for you. Now, when you read the pasuk, there is no for you in there for the animals. It doesn't say that. So that's only occurring for the people. And this, says Rosh Cirilio, is explaining that the animal food is exempt from this requirement and restriction and can be used even for medicinal plasters. How perfect is the Torah? So the Gemara is going to ask a question. It's going to say, let us exclude animal food as well from being made into plasters for people. For the verse states, and for your animal, all its crop shall be to eat. And this is going to imply that animal food should be for the animals to eat, but not for medicinal purposes and plasters. That's the question, and the Gemara is going to answer it. Rabbi Bon Barchia says, any exposition you expound and contradict thereby a prior exposition is not a valid exposition. So what's going on over here? And the Rosh Cirilio explains about this, since we've already explained the preceding verse as teaching that animal food can be turned into a plaster for a person, we cannot explain this verse as teaching that animal foods may not be made into a plaster for humans. So there's a rule in the Torah that when you're getting a halacha, it has to connect to a pasuk. And so this pasuk about using plasters from animal foods, that's already been taught for this superfluous for you. There's distinction between human food and animal food with respect to plasters for humans. Again, we already have a source for how you can turn animal food into a plaster for a person. Okay, that's going to come from this pasuk in Vayikra. Now, we can't look at this for another halacha. We have to find another source. We have to find another way to look at it. So Rabbi Yosei did not say it like this. In other words, like Rabbi Zera said. He's going to explain it a little bit differently. Okay, he's going to say, rather, he offered the following explanation on the basis for distinguishing between human food and animal food. And he says about this verse, we're again staying with the same verse here, it says that the verse states that the Shabbos produce of the land shall be for you to eat. And to eat is going to exclude Sheviis produce for purposes other than eating, like making plasters or cosmetics. So the verse is going to continue. It's going to say, for you, for your slave, for your maidservant, for your animal, all its crop shall be to eat. Now, Rabbi Yossi is basically teaching that in this clause as well, to eat is going to imply an exclusion on using Sheviis produce for a purpose other than eating, like making plasters. So the Torah is presenting an exclusion, says this Gemara, on using Sheviis produce for plasters, following another exclusion regarding the same matter. So this general rule governing exclusions, following exclusions, is that they actually come to include something. That seems very complicated. Now let's explain this a little bit. So one of the ideas when you're sitting there looking at scripture and you're trying to get an idea of what's going on in the halacha is that when you have two exclusions and they come right after each other, one is going to qualify the other. In other words, it's going to create a double negative. And the overall effect is going to make it so that it's included. So because this has two negatives, it becomes permitted, says Rabbi Yossi. So the idea is that in this verse, yes, it has two exclusions on Sheviis produce for plasters, and that the effect would be that it's actually going to be allowed where you can take Sheviis produce and you can actually use it for plaster for people. Okay, so the idea is that the double exclusion in the pasuk actually makes it permitted. Now, the Gemara is going to continue. Again, we're continuing with Rabbi Yossi's point, and he says that the verse comes to include animal foods of Sheviis for non-eating usage, meaning that they can be made into a plaster for people, but only human foods may not be made into plaster for humans. So the Gemara is going to ask questions and say, but on the basis of this double exclusion, let us also include human foods of Sheviis for the possibility of making plasters for humans. In other words, if you're going to go by this double exclusion thing, well, why not allow the human food to be turned into plasters for people? And the Gemara is going to answer that. It's going to say that this verse can't possibly mean to permit all produce of Sheviis for plasters. Because like what Rabbi Bon Bar Hia says in above, this is going to be in the beginning of the Gemara, it says that any exposition that you expound and contradict, thereby a prior exposition is not a valid exposition. So the idea is that since we explained the first exclusion as prohibiting the use of Sheviis produce for making plasters, we cannot expound the second exclusion as coming to permit this use for all produce of Sheviis. Rather, we must expound the second exclusion as coming to permit only certain types of Sheviis produce for use in making plasters. Let me explain this, okay? You have the pasuk, okay? And they've accepted Rabbi Chia Bar Bun's question to Rabbi Zera about this. They're saying, wait a second, this for you, okay? This for you is being used to show that, it's supposed to be to eat, okay? Now, the taking it and turning it into a medical plaster, it's excluded because it's for you to eat, okay? And so they've used this part of the pasuk now to get a halacha. That's the halacha. But you can't now take Rabbi Yossi's double exclusion and say, oh, you should be allowed to use the medical plaster for people as well, where you're taking it and turning human food into medical plaster for people. It should be okay. Why? Because they've already expounded on the first part of this exclusion. Now, on the second exclusion, it's going to be permitted only for the second part, which is going to be what is talking about in the animal food. So the idea is that, yes, you have a double exclusion there, and that double exclusion is going to be saying that it's going to be permitted, but because you've already expounded on this first extra part in the pasuk, this extra for you, okay, this is superfluous. This is trying to teach a halacha, and this is going to be connected to this to eat. That means that you can't take human food, turn it into plaster. That's already used to expound. But nonetheless, you still have this double negative here. What do you do with it? And what they're trying to say is that the second part of the pasuk is going to be where it's going to be dealing only with the animal food, and because it's a double negative, it becomes permitted. What becomes permitted? This other use. This is going to be the plaster, and that is why you're only going to be able to use it for an animal food that gets turned into plaster and only used for people. Because again, you have this double exclusion makes it permitted, but because the first part is already explained as a different halacha, you can't reuse parts of pasukim for halachot. And so since it already has a use to derive a halacha, you have to use the second part of it. Now, yes, you have a double negative, but it's coming only to apply to this second part. That's going to be the idea, and that's how you're going to get this halacha, that the animal plaster is going to be allowed to be turned into human, the animal food is going to be turned into human plaster. But what's going to be excluded on that is going to be this to eat for people, in other words, and for animals. So in other words, you still can't take the animal food, turn it into a plaster for an animal, because again, that's still going to be excluded. So the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, in this manner, both explanations are valid, as Rabbi Matanya said, and when you expound the first exclusion to exclude Sheviis produce from being used in making plasters, it is human foods that you have excluded from this use. And when you expound the second exclusion to include Sheviis produce from being used in making plasters, it is animal foods that you have included in this use. So again, these do not contradict, and this is the derivation for how we're interpreting Scripture as permitting only the animal foods to be used in plasters for human. Now, human foods are fit for a significant use for feeding people, and that's what's going to, make it where it's going to be restricted to turn it into a inferior use product like a cosmetic. And that's a problem because it becomes degraded, and you've degraded this Sheviis produce. But on animal foods, turning it into a plaster for people is going to be considered to be more significant. It's going to be considered an upgrade for the regular use of just feeding an animal like a goat. And the idea is that a human use is going to be considered an upgrade and superior to the animal use. And that's how we're getting at it. But this is how they're expounding the from the dikduk of the scripture, and this is what makes the Yerushalmi so magical. So we see this source for the Mishnah's ruling regarding animal food, and now the Gemara wants to get into this permit to use animal food for for human non-food needs. So again, what about these human non-food needs, right? You're taking animal food. Animal food has Sheviis sanctity, but how does it work where you're upgrading it, okay, where you've improved it? So the Gemara says regarding animal foods, what is the law with respect to processing them into dyes for humans? And it's going to ask, is this permitted, like making them into plasters for humans or not? And the Gemara is going to resolve the inquiry on the basis of Kal V'chomer, and it's going to say, if even human foods which may not be made into a plaster for humans, as this Mishnah states, may be made into dyes for humans, then regarding animal foods which may be made into plaster for humans, as stated in this Mishnah, is it not obvious that they may be made into dyes for humans? Well, the Pnei Moshe points out, and I want to cover this a little bit, and we covered this, by the way, in 7.1, but the Torah statement that Sheviis produce shall be to eat is going to imply that it can't go to waste, okay? And the Pnei Moshe is pointing out that the Gemara is going to ask whether animal food can be used to make into dye is going to be like wasting, okay? Is it going to be, perhaps that you've like turned it into something that's less significant, and you could have fed it to an animal, and perhaps this dye is going to be considered to be less significant than feeding it to an animal. Now, we were talking about making plasters for people, and in the case of a dye, or in the case of the plaster, taking the animal food and turning it into a plaster for a person is going to be considered an upgrade. It's going to be considered more significant than taking it and just feeding an animal. And that's going to be because a plaster is going to provide people with physical benefit. Now, the idea is that dyes are going to provide only, says the Pnei Moshe, an intangible satisfaction. So the idea is that this is not exactly the same as a medicinal plaster, right? This is something that you're getting pleasure by the color, okay, and that's like intangible, okay. And the question is whether this is going to be considered wasteful. And by the way, even if you're taking animal food, is it going to be considered wasteful of animal food? And when we're talking about all this, we're talking about whether this can be used or not. Now, the issue is going to be what about we're saying dyes for humans, okay? So this is talking about dyes like henna that they can use to decorate the skin, or it could be used for clothing, or it could be used for people's utensils, even, by the way. So the Gemara is going to continue with this, okay? And it's going to say, consider conceding the point that the Gemara presents an inquiry in regards to a different item regarding inedible plant species that are designated for being made into plasters. What is the law with respect to processing them into dyes for humans? Is it allowed or not? So let's say you have a plant species in the Jerusalem forest and you can't eat it. And basically it's just being used to go for a medicinal use. Well, if you're going to take that same plant and you're going to use it for a plant dye, what is that going to be? Is that now going to get Sheviis sanctity or not? Now, if you have an inedible plant and you're turning it into a medical plaster, this is a plant that's unfit for human consumption, and it's being made into a medicinal plaster. So that's being used for people that should not have Sheviis sanctity. But what about a dye? I mean, a dye is going to be something that could be used by all people, and it is going to provide this intangible satisfaction, as the Pnei Moshe points out. So what's going to be the status on that? And the Gemara is going to resolve this. It's going to say, also on the basis of Kal V'chomer, the Gemara says, if even species designated as human foods, which may not be made into plaster for humans, may be made into dyes for humans, then regarding species designated for making plaster, which obviously may be made into a plaster for humans, is it not obvious that they may be made into dyes for humans? So the question is, what's going to be considered wasteful, okay? And, we're basically asking a question on the assumption that the plant species that is designated for making plasters have Sheviis sanctity. Now, if it doesn't have Sheviis sanctity, you can do what you want. Now, the question comes though, well, wait a second, perhaps it should get Sheviis sanctity when you're turning it into a dye. That's going to be the question. And the Gemara is going to revise this question a little bit differently. Okay, Gemara says, indeed, there is no need for this line of inquiry about processing different items into dyes for people. Rather, we inquire as follows. Regarding animal foods, what is the law with respect to making them dye into dyes for animals? Is this going to be allowed or not? So the idea is that you're taking these dyes and you're going to dye the body of the animal so you can mark it to know like what goes out for slaughter or not. And it could also be used to dye clothing or utensils. So is this going to be allowed or not? And the Gemara is going to suggest that there's a logical resolution to this question. So again, if you're taking this non-Sheviis plant and now you're upgrading it to a dye and people are going to get satisfaction from it. And by the way, it's available to the general population. A lot of people like the color blue. A lot of people like the color red. A lot of people might find the color yellow very pleasing on that. And so the idea is that now it's open for general use. The question is, does this get upgraded with Sheviis sanctity or not? The plant did not have Sheviis sanctity. What's going to happen now? It was not classified as human food. So what are we going to do? And so the Gemara is going to say, just as you say regarding human foods that may not be made into a plaster for human, as stated in this Mishnah, that they may nevertheless be made into dyes for people, we may say similarly regarding animal foods that they may not be made into a plaster for people, as stated in the Mishnah, and we may nevertheless make them from dyes for animals. So, the idea here, says the Marafulda, is that the laws of using animal foods for other animal needs should be parallel to the laws of human foods for human needs. So this, by the way, gets rejected by Rabbi Yossi, and the Gemara is going to continue, and we're gonna see what it says. So the Gemara continues. Rabbi Yossi says that the law of processing animal foods into animal dyes cannot be derived from that of processing human foods into human dyes. And the question is, why may human foods be made into dyes for people? The idea is because dyes for people have Sheviis sanctity. So this is going to be, okay, you have this inedible plant and it can be used to make a dye for people. Well, now this should get Sheviis sanctity, okay? So the idea is that now that you've upgraded it, and the idea is that since you've taken this inedible plant and you've upgraded it to a dye for people, it's going to be significant enough, and basically, again, it has this like category of like, oh, all the people can use this, right? All the people can get pleasure from it. So since, by the way, we were covering this before, since this was in Mishnah 7:1, since dyes are going to be included as a human need, and like food, then and a human use like food, right, or like lighting a candle, this is going to be a case where this is going to be where it's going to be significant enough and it's going to be general enough where it's going to get Sheviis sanctity. And so, the thing is that, if it's significant enough to be permitted for a human food, that would give it Sheviis sanctity. And then if it's a non-edible plant and it gets this significant use out of it that, can be this general use for all people, then it's going to get the sanctity. Okay, but that's going to be different than firewood, right? Because firewood doesn't have this general use category. You're just using it just for yourself, and so it's a little bit different. The Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, shall we also permit one to make animal food into dyes for animals when dye stuff for animals have no Sheviis sanctity? Surely not. The idea is that since making a dye for an animal is not significant enough to attach Sheviis sanctity to plants designated for that purpose, then it is also not significant enough to be a permitted use for animal foods that have Sheviis sanctity. In other words, when you're taking dyes for animals, which, by the way, are these inedible plants, the pigments are not as good. It's just used to mark an animal to be like, okay, this one goes out to be, go for slaughter. And these, inedible plants produce an inferior dye, and it's just for dyeing an animal. And maybe even the utensils that, are, dealing with animals. Okay, you're not going to use your nice dyes to, dye, animal tools. So the idea is that it's not significant enough and it's not going to have Sheviis sanctity. So the Vilna Goan is going to talk about this, and he's going to say that when a function is too insignificant to bestow Sheviis sanctity upon plants cultivated for that function, it cannot be considered a useful function under Sheviis guidelines. And therefore, says the Vilna Goan, that the function with items that have Sheviis sanctity is considered wasteful and is forbidden. And so while human foods may be converted into a useful function of making dyes for people, animal foods may not be converted to a wasteful function of making dyes for animals. So that's going to be the answer to it. So we're going to continue with the rest of this halacha, and we're going to finish this up as a second part of the shiur. And have a great day. And this is really important because we're getting at the deeper points of how the Torah is written, and that is worthwhile. Have a great day.